Good evening. If you would, get a Bible, turn with me to Proverbs chapter 23. Proverbs 23 is where we'll get started. This part of our worship tonight, Proverbs 23. It's good to see you tonight. I want you to know that we're going to do something a little different tonight for our lesson. This is going to be a Q&A night. Several of you have asked me questions and made requests of me about certain Bible topics and passages. And we're going to spend our time tonight going over your questions, which means basically there's going to be 3 different topics tonight, and they are not related at all. Don't even bother trying to connect them. They are not connected. But I want to say something about this before we get started so nobody gets the wrong idea. Q&A night is not a back and forth where I open it up and you guys all ask me questions and I take questions. That would be a disaster. We don't want to do that. Instead, you have asked me questions. I have taken time and kind of crafted a biblical response, and we'll go over that tonight. If you still have questions after my response, which is entirely possible, come ask me again after, and we'll have a different question for a different Q&A night, and we'll go over it again, or maybe we can just talk, you and me. But the idea here is that we have questions, and these questions can be of general benefit to everybody. And that you might be curious what someone else has asked. In fact, there may be some questions asked tonight that you say, that's a good question, I never thought of that, or that's a good question, I've always wanted to ask that. So if you have questions, I want you to know that I'm happy to address them and take time like this where we can talk about them. But I want to give you a couple of caveats about that. First of all, if you do ask me a question, please be sure that I write it down. Because if you tell me something, I will nod and I'll say, that's a great question, good point. But if you don't see me write it down, it's gone forever, okay? I will not remember. I'll leave the building, I'll get in the car, and I'll say, Sarah, I was supposed to remember something, and I don't remember what it was. So send me a text, send me an email, or make sure that I write it down on my phone while we're talking. But I'm happy to take your questions about that. The other caveat is, I reserve veto power on your question. So just because you ask a question doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to address it. Some questions are not good for the public assembly, and they need to be answered in a different format. And so I'll use discretion on that, but I'll try to get back to you in some form, if at all possible. Well, that's a lot of prelude. Let's just ask the questions. First, what does the Bible teach about gluttony? Proverbs 23 and verse 20. Proverbs 23 and verse 20. Says, be not among drunkards or among gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags. So he warns us here about our presence among drunkards and gluttons. But the reasoning is not because these things are morally wrong, at least not in this text. The reason is because, verse 21, they're going to be poor. You get the implication. They're out of control with their food and drink, and so they're going to keep eating and drinking until they run out of money. And if you're among them, they may eat and drink your money. So it's not a wise course. So that's probably the idea behind this proverb. Well, I didn't put this proverb up. Never mind. Ignore that. We'll come to that in a minute. Proverbs 28 and verse 7 is another that has a similar idea. The one who keeps the law is a son with understanding, but a companion of gluttons shames his father. Proverbs 28:7. A companion of gluttons probably has that same meaning. You might also notice as you look at this text in verse 20 of Proverbs 23 that it groups gluttons and drunkards together. That these are sort of the 2 basic eating and drinking, but both of them done to excess. You're eating so much that you're a glutton, you're drinking so much that you're a drunkard. So both of them imply a lack of restraint, and they sort of go together in the biblical mind. I'll show you that in a couple of places. Now we're ready for this passage. This is Deuteronomy 21 and verse 18. It says, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of his city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones, so you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. I'm sure somebody is thinking, I wish that was the Q&A part of the question, like why we kill our rebellious sons, but it's not. So we'll have to say that for another time. But you see, part of the problem is this is not just a young child. This is someone who is of age, and they're stubborn and rebellious, but particularly, he's a glutton and a drunkard. So his refusal to discipline himself, his rebellion, is in part encapsulated by those two facts. He doesn't eat or drink in moderation. He is not careful about that. You can also see why it would be such an insult for people to make this accusation about Jesus, which is exactly what they do in Luke 7:33. John the Baptist came eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So if he doesn't eat and drink, he has a demon. If he does eat and drink, then he eats and drinks to excess. So you see, you can't win with this crowd. So just like the people back in Deuteronomy, just like the people in Proverbs, they're saying Jesus is like that. He's a fool. He is someone to be shunned and shamed. Perhaps he even deserves death, like that rebellious son in Deuteronomy 18. All right, the other is, we need to notice this passage before we kind of get into the meat of what we're doing. Meat was not a pun, by the way. This is Titus 1:12 and 13. One of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true, therefore rebuke them sharply that they may be sound in the faith. So Paul is writing to Titus, who's working on the island of Crete, and there are some cultural problems on the island where this is the way Cretans are. Even today in English, we still use the word Cretan to mean kind of a not-so-great person, and they were then too. But part of it is they're lazy gluttons, and he says, hey, that's true, so rebuke them so that they may be sound in the faith. In other words, you can't go on being a lazy glutton and a Christian. That's not going to work together. You need to be rebuked so that you can get yourself under control. So what is the problem with gluttony? Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and I want to spend a little time here. 1 Corinthians 6. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12, the text says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. So Paul has in mind, I do believe here, when he talks about food and the stomach, I think he has in mind eating meat sacrificed to idols that he'll talk about in chapter 8 and in chapter 10. It's really the context of chapter 8 through 10. But what he is saying here seems to me to be, you can make an argument that meat is clean and you can eat what you want. And in a way that's true. All things are lawful. Yes, that's true. But notice again in verse 12, he says, not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but I will not be dominated by anything. It seems to me that the problem with gluttony is a control problem. That very easily we can get out of control with our food and with the desires of our body so that we are no longer the one telling our body what to do, but we are the victims of our body's desires. And Paul says that's not the way a Christian lives. I will not be dominated or mastered by anything. And I believe Paul is absolutely universal when he says that. The only thing that will master or dominate me is the Lord Jesus. Not any substance, not any desire. And so I believe gluttony would fit into that category. And in fact, he alludes to that in verse 13. Gluttony shows that I am unable to tell myself no. I cannot stop. I cannot stop whether it's I eat more than I should or more than I need, or I cannot stop while I'm in the middle of eating so that I say, you know what, that's just enough. So this passage also shows us that it's not really an excuse to say that food is a good thing. Food is a good thing, but as verse 12 says, it might not be a helpful thing, and it might even be something that enslaves us. There's another passage here that I think would be relevant. It's Proverbs 25:16. It says, if you have found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it. There comes a point, doesn't there, when even a good thing becomes bad? There comes a point where we have to say, you know what? I'm going to push the plate away. That's enough. I've just had enough. And I think honey is a great example of that. I think most people like the flavor and taste of honey. But if that's all you eat, or you keep eating it and eating it, there comes a point where you say, you know what? That's enough. And he says, don't let it be the point where you actually can't take in anymore and you end up vomiting. There's wisdom in saying, you know what? Just a little bit is plenty. So while we're talking about food, I think that this passage, the one we just looked at, this passage might not just be about food. That maybe it's a principle about life. That, yeah, I mean, obviously, it fits with food. But isn't it true of all good things? That there has to be a point where we say, you know what, that's nice, that's pleasant, but that can't be all I do, and I can't do it so much that it becomes a problem for me. The principle here is that even with pleasant things, we need restraint. So let me just give you a little list here. Pleasant things: television, video games, cell phones, pleasant time with our friends, engagement with the opposite sex, food and drink. Pleasant things. Some things we know are just off limits to us, and we say, you know, there's not a time where that's okay. But these things just require restraint and moderation. Those who obey God see the need for that restraint. I would also point out that our culture is not really helping us here. Our culture does not push us in the direction of restraint about anything. But especially when we talk about food, we are so wealthy in our nation that many Americans are struggling with weight and obesity, and that is often tied directly to our lack of self-control about eating. I just think we have to talk about that honestly. Now, please don't assume that about other people. That's not always true. And that's an unfair judgment of everyone. We cannot tell whether someone is out of control simply by looking at them. But I think we have to honestly ask ourselves that question. And we have to remember that it will always be countercultural for us to push the plate away and say, I've had enough. I'll just say, too, that we have a whole industry that overfeeds us and makes money off serving us delicious food at every meal. Every time you eat, it should be the finest thing you've ever eaten. And we're wealthy enough to make that happen a lot of times. So there has to be something that pulls us back from that, right? What would that be? It won't be anything that's going on in our culture. It will have to be from within. So, questions that leaves me with. Am I in control? Or is my body? Am I doing anything in excess? And if I am, why? Why would I do that? Why would I act that way? And then third, are my choices influencing other people toward Jesus? That's a question to ask, yes, even of my food and drink. Whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God, Paul says. So that is not exempt. My encouragement to you is don't be a glutton. And by that, I mean don't be a person who is unable to tell themselves no. Second question. How does the biblical principle, to whom much is given, of him much will be required, apply to how we use our talents? I told you this is a totally different question. Don't try to connect it to gluttony. We're on to the next one, okay? How does this principle apply to our talents? So this question refers to one of Jesus' favorite kinds of sayings. Jesus talks like this a lot. And I'll show you a couple of different ways this comes out. This is Mark 4:24 and 25. Pay attention to what you hear. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you, and still more will be added to you. For to the one who has, more will be given, and from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. So here we're talking about how we handle the information or insight Jesus gives us. And that if we do well with what we hear, we'll get more. But if we refuse to hear, even what we have will be taken away. Think about the seed that falls on the wayside that's just plucked up. Even what they have is taken away. Or in another place, Luke 12:48, this is the parable of the servant waiting for his master who is supposed to be faithful, but instead he takes advantage of the situation and begins to get drunk and beat his fellow servants. And it says, Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. Here, it's about how when you've been given extra responsibility, well, you're going to have a more severe judgment. So there is an expectation that we will live up to what God has given us. So that's another way Jesus likes to talk like this. But the heart of this question is based in Jesus' parable of the talents. So I'm going to go over there to Matthew chapter 25 and look at that for a minute. Matthew chapter 25. We're going to read this entire parable for a moment. Matthew 25, beginning in verse 14. It says, "For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted them his property." Matthew 25, verse 15 now. "To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours.' But his master answered him, 'You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scatter no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." I think it's pretty straightforward and probably familiar story. Master gives different amounts of money, and the talents, by the way, are not talents in the way we talk about it. It's a weight of money, probably gold. 5 talents to one, 2 talents to one, and 1 talent to one. The 5-talent man takes and trades his and makes 5 more talents. 2-talent man trades his, makes 2 talents more. But the focus of the story, I think you can tell, is on that 1-talent man who is intimidated by his master. And so he buries his money in the sand. Verse 29, Jesus says, "To everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." Jesus says, if we refuse to use what God has given us, then even what we have will be taken from us, that there will be a reckoning and a judgment. So a few ideas from this text, from Jesus' story. First, I think it's obvious that everything that we have and everything that we are is expected to be viewed as a gift. This is something God has given us. But this story illustrates that God wants us to do something with what he's given us. That's the expectation. And that there will be a time in the story, it's when the master comes back, the return of Jesus, where we're going to give an account for how we have used the things he has given us. So that principle needs to be in the forefront of our minds. I think it's a principle in all areas of Christian living, that we are recipients of grace, and because we have received grace, we have an obligation to the giver, that now we're going to live according to the will of the giver and use his gifts for him. Peter talks about this. This is 1 Peter 4 and verse 10. He says, "As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace." As you've received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards. A steward is someone who has charge of someone else's property, as good stewards of God's varied grace. I hope you hear in that God's grace is varied, that God gives different kind of gifts to people. Just look around the room. We're all different. And each one of us has unique gifts, talents, skills, even training, education, things we do, others can't do. And he says, if you've received a gift, use it to serve one another. Don't bury it in the sand. Don't just use it for yourself. Use it to bless other people. This is a principle that we need to take in and live out. So maybe it means that we have skills that we can use directly to serve each other. Skills, opportunities, energy. For example, some of you, not some of us, but some of you can fix cars. Some of us can move furniture. Some of us can calm babies. Others of us cannot, by the way. Some of us can tutor students. We all have things we can do, and we can directly use those skills and gifts and time and energy to bless other people. Use it to serve one another. It may be that you have gifts that you use in your employment, and you go use those gifts and you make money, and then you take that money and you use that to bless other people. Whatever your gifts are, God wants you to use them. Now, I don't want us to think that our gifts are restricted to something that we can make money off of, but neither are they excluded from that. It could be either, it could be both. So part of the challenge in this question is about identifying our particular gifts. After all, God's grace is varied, and it's going to look different in your life than it does in mine. Sometimes Paul makes little lists of different kinds of gifts God gives, like in Romans 12, where he talks about leading and giving and serving and encouraging and showing mercy. But I also want to say, and I know this from some experience, sometimes this process can be overwhelming. Because you start wondering, well, which ones are my gifts? And you start to wonder, am I ever doing enough? Am I ever using my gifts enough? And in the back of your mind is that picture of the master in the talent parable. Angry. And it is a little bit frightening. So let me encourage you this way. First, we need to identify our gifts. And if you have trouble with that, you might ask someone close to you, someone who likes you, by the way, who will tell you these are the things that you do well and these are the things that are your skills. Then we may need to take some time to cultivate those gifts. I believe that's part of what he's teaching us in the parable of the talents. That here are men who took their gifts and they made them into something more than they were. And so the 5-talent man becomes a 10-talent man. And the 2-talent man becomes a 4-talent man because they do work to make those gifts sharper and more beneficial so that their master is pleased. Then we need to serve other people with our gifts. Think about how what I am, who I am, and what I can do may bless other people. But can I just add this at the end? It might help us to just live one day at a time and try to serve in the day that we have. And think about, how can I serve other people today? I say this, again, with some experience from talking to people who've really struggled with the idea. It is awfully hard to spend every day of your life trying to validate the meaning of your life in this day. Am I ever doing enough for other people? It's overwhelming. So let me suggest that there is a place for honest examination. But the question is always, am I serving other people? The people who Jesus condemns are either actively wicked, like the man who's getting drunk and beating his fellow servants, or they're doing nothing, like the man who buries his talent in the sand. So am I serving? And then I'll also just say, before we leave this, there are some tough decisions we may have to make about this, where we're trying to discern which path is the absolute best use of our time and money and energy. And those decisions, I'm not sure, always have a right or wrong answer. Very often, it may just be that God has blessed us in a lot of different ways, and we need to serve God and serve others and trust that He'll see that desire to serve Him with what He's given us. So that's what I would say about how that principle applies to how we use our talents. The third question is, what does it mean to lift holy hands? Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy 2. This question asks about a specific phrase here. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 8. Paul writes, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. I first want to say that when Paul writes the words in verse 8, I desire, he is speaking with apostolic authority. That Paul talks this way sometimes. He is not just saying, hey, I'm Paul, this is what I like. Instead, he is saying, I, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, have these instructions for the assembly. And he describes things here as they should be. This is the culture that should exist in verse 8 among Christian men. He wants men to lead. Because as we'll talk about in a minute, verse 9, where it talks about women, has the word likewise, that women are going to follow the lead of Christian men. So what should those men be like? So verse 8 says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray. That Christian men are to be a prayerful people, characterized by prayer. And that along with that prayer, he says in verse 8, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Lifting holy hands here is not a gesture. This is a Hebraic way of describing a righteous life. In the Old Testament, the hands describe the things we've done and the life we are living, the type of people that we are. Sometimes that's about how we worship God with our hands. So let me show you a couple of places here. Psalm 63 and verse 4, so I will bless your name as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. Notice how lifting up hands and blessing your name are parallel. This is what they do to worship God. They lift up their hands to him. Psalm 134 and verse 2, lift up your hands to the holy place and bless the Lord. So there is part of this that is about you pray and you lift your hands toward God. We're reaching out toward God. But I also want you to notice that when it says lifting holy hands, that expression has some intense meaning, because look at how it is described when the life of the worshiper is not righteous. I'll show you a couple of places. Isaiah 1:15, when you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Now, we're not being literal here. You know, you're trying to worship me, and when you put your hands up, there's blood all over them. God is describing their lives. And your life, you come and you stretch out your hands in prayer, and I look at your hands, and all I see is the blood you've shed. All I see is the life you're living. In Job 16, verse 16, he says, my face is red with weeping, although there is no violence in my hands and my prayer is pure. Notice the hands and prayer are connected again, but he says, there's nothing in my hands, no violence here. My prayer is pure. My hands are clean, God. And in the New Testament, James says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. I trust you know James is not advocating washing your hands when he says cleanse your hands. He's saying you need to change your lives. You need to repent of your evil. If we think we can pray to God without acknowledging and repenting of the blood on our hands, the evil we have done, then it is the height of foolishness. Do we think God wouldn't know that our hands are full of blood? So what you see then is that when Paul says in verse 8 that we are lifting holy hands, he means that we pray as the fruit of a holy life. He explains that in the rest of verse 8, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. And yours might have something like doubting there, because some manuscripts are different in that last word. But his point is, our lives are clean, our prayer is sincere, we mean what we're saying, we're not approaching God in our anger, as if we want God to get back at somebody who's made us mad. We're not approaching God to take our side in some dispute that we have with others. Our hands are clean. Then in verse 9, he says, likewise also that women should adore themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. I want you to notice that likewise in verse 9 at the very beginning, or in like manner, that women are supposed to dress with self-control and modesty. I want to suggest something here, and I just want you to consider it. We talk a lot about modest dress, and we should, because after all, our culture is certainly not pointing our young ladies in the direction of more modesty. Modesty here means that we're not trying to get attention by the things that we wear, but instead we are trying to show others by the things that we wear and the way we present ourselves that we are truly women of God. But I want to suggest something. Could it be that the struggles we have with verse 9 stem from failures in verse 8? Could it be that male Christian culture is not prayerful and clean and holy and uncomplaining, and that might contribute to the problem of immodesty? Could it be that women struggle with dressing properly because men are not setting a tone of piety? Could it be that what Christian women see is that Christian men value immodesty? They pay more attention to those who are flashy or those who are unclothed. Could it be that there is far more gawking than prayer among our men? I'm not saying that justifies the struggles that Christian women may have in this arena. I'm saying Paul wants men to lead and women to follow likewise. And if Christian men don't have holy hands and are not leading in prayer, then it will at least help us understand and explain. Maybe we have gotten caught up in the sexual fascination of our culture, and maybe our women struggle as a result. Just something for your consideration. Somebody's going to ask me, though, well, Jacob, you didn't talk about what I wanted you to talk about, which is, what about sticking your hands up when you pray? Well, I'll just say a little something about that. Lots of different prayer postures in the Bible. Some people lift their eyes to heaven, and remember, some people are unwilling to lift their eyes to heaven, like the tax collector in Luke 18. Some people bow their knees. Some people stretch out their hands. Some people, and most of the time us, simply bow our heads. I cannot tell you how to pray. But I can tell you there's no particular way that we do it that's described in the Bible. It seems to me to be an intensely personal matter. So I would encourage you to pray in the way that does not involve trying to be seen by other people, and instead communicates what you want to communicate directly to God. But can I say that far more important than prayer posture is prayer? Actually praying? I'm much more concerned about whether I am and my kids are and we as a congregation are a prayerful people than I am with what exactly that looks like in our bodies. So to me, the question is, am I really sharing my heart and my life with my Lord? Is this something that I'm doing for real? Am I following Paul's instruction? Is this real for us? So that's what it means to lift holy hands. I believe that's a life issue, and I believe that is not really touching the physical part, but that we need to pray in the way that is going to communicate what we seek to communicate to God. Thank you so much for your attention. That was our Q&A night. Appreciate the questions. And again, if you have more questions, feel free to let me know about those. This is the time where we have the invitation. It's a part of our service where we want anyone here who needs to respond to God's call on their life, and you need to make something known to this group so that we can pray with you, or if there is someone here who is ready to take a step toward the Lord Jesus and to become a disciple of Jesus tonight by turning away from their sins and putting their faith in Him, being baptized into Christ. We'd love to help.